Thomas Brennan's rifle froze mid-aim, his weathered finger trembling on the trigger as 10 women in blood-stained pioneer dresses stumbled through the mountain mist toward his cabin. For 19 winters, he'd spoken to no one but the wind and his own ghosts. These weren't lost travelers. They moved like soldiers. The youngest woman collapsed first, her knees hitting the rocky ground with a sickening crack that echoed through the Colorado pines. The others formed a protective circle around her, eyes scanning the tree line with military precision that made Tom's war-scarred heart skip. Behind them, smoke rose from the valley. Too much smoke, too black, carrying the smell of burning buildings and something worse. The woman leading them looked directly at him through his rifle scope, her gray hair wild, but her spine straight as a cavalry officer's. She mouthed one word that made his blood freeze. Patterson. Tom lowered his weapon, knowing his 19 years of hiding were over. Whatever hell these women had escaped was coming for him too. The question burning in his chest wasn't whether he'd fight, it was whether he'd live long enough to learn why they'd run to him. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Colorado Mountains had been Thomas Brennan's sanctuary for 19 winters, ever since the day he'd buried his cavalry uniform, along with his faith in God and country. At 52, his hands still bore the calluses of a soldier, but his heart carried the weight of a man who'd seen too much killing and done too much of it himself. The ranch he'd carved from this wilderness wasn't legally his. The deed belonged to a dead man whose name he'd borrowed. But possession was 9/10 of the law out here where government surveyors feared to tread. Every morning Tom walked the same ritual. Coffee black as his memories, a check on his small herd of cattle, and 30 minutes staring at the grave marker he'd carved for his wife Sarah. She died in his arms during the Nez Perce conflicts of 1877, caught in crossfire between two worlds that couldn't find peace. The Army called it collateral damage. Tom called it the day his soul died. The ranch sat in a hidden valley, accessible only through a narrow pass that Tom had deliberately left unmarked on any map. Pine forests stretched in every direction, broken only by granite peaks that scraped the belly of God. It was country that forgave nothing and forgot less, where a man could disappear completely if he had reason enough. Tom had reason. His nearest neighbor lived 20 miles down the mountain, and the closest town, Cedar Falls, was a 2-day ride through terrain that killed the unprepared. Tom preferred it that way. The silence had become his closest companion, broken only by the wind through the pines and the occasional cry of a red-tailed hawk. He'd grown his beard long and gray, let his hair touch his shoulders, and wore clothes that had seen too many seasons. To any stranger's eye, he looked like what he claimed to be, a hermit rancher who wanted nothing from the world but to be left alone. But Thomas Brennan carried secrets deeper than his isolation. Hidden beneath loose floorboards in his cabin lay a cavalry officer's dress uniform, complete with lieutenant colonel's insignia and a Congressional Medal of Honor he'd never worn. More damning still were the military dispatches bearing his real name and the orders he'd followed during the Indian Wars, orders that had cost innocent lives and earned him a reputation as one of the Army's most effective and ruthless field commanders. The cough that had been troubling him for months was getting worse. Some mornings he woke tasting copper, and he knew what that meant. The mountains had given him peace, but they wouldn't give him much more time. Perhaps that was justice. Perhaps that was mercy. Now, watching 10 desperate women approach his sanctuary, Tom felt the weight of his past pressing against his chest like a boulder. He recognized the look in their eyes, the same hollow desperation he'd seen in refugee camps during the wars. These women were running from something, And in the vast emptiness of the Colorado wilderness, they'd somehow found their way to the one man who understood what it meant to need a place to hide. The question was whether he'd live long enough to find out why. The evening of August 10, 1896, brought more than the usual mountain chill to Thomas Brennan's valley. He'd spent the day mending fence posts, his hands working automatically while his mind wrestled with the morning's encounter. The 10 women had collapsed near his property line just after dawn. Their leader, a steel-haired woman who carried herself like she'd once commanded respect, had simply said they needed shelter. Nothing more. Nothing less. Tom found them huddled beneath the overhang of his barn, the youngest among them shivering despite the August heat. The woman who'd spoken that morning stepped forward as he approached, her chin raised in defiance that couldn't quite mask the exhaustion in her green eyes. "Name's Margaret O'Connor," she said, extending a dirt-stained hand. "We're grateful for the shelter, mister?" "Brennan." Tom Brennan. He studied her face, noting the refined bone structure beneath the grime, the way she positioned herself between him and the others. "You ladies seem to have traveled a fair distance." Margaret's laugh held no humor. "You could say that." She gestured toward the oldest of the group, a silver-haired woman sitting with her back against the barn wall, breathing hard. "Eleanor here needs rest. We all do. We can work for our keep. We're not asking for charity." Tom's eyes moved over the group, taking inventory with the soldier's eye he'd never quite lost. 10 women, ages ranging from perhaps 25 to nearly 70. Their clothes told a story of hasty departure, torn skirts, missing buttons, shoes worn thin from hard walking. But it was their eyes that troubled him most. He'd seen that look before, in the faces of refugees fleeing Sherman's march, in the hollow stares of Apache children rounded up for reservation life. These were people who'd lost everything and were running from something worse than poverty. "Mister, we ain't asking for charity," the youngest woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're asking for humanity." The words hit Tom like a physical blow. Humanity. When was the last time anyone had accused him of possessing that particular virtue? He looked at Eleanor, whose weathered hands trembled as she tried to steady herself against the barn wall. Something in her face reminded him of his own mother, who'd died while he was away at war, alone in a charity hospital because her son had been too busy killing strangers to tend his own blood. "There's a stew pot on the stove," Tom said finally, "and beds enough for everyone. We'll sort out the details come morning." As he led them into his cabin, Tom noticed things that made the soldier in him uneasy. Margaret moved with the measured pace of someone accustomed to formations. When a loose board creaked underfoot, 3 of the women automatically stepped to positions that would provide cover for the others. These weren't ordinary pioneer women fleeing domestic troubles. They'd been trained for something. Inside the cabin, Eleanor sank into Tom's favorite chair by the fireplace with a grateful sigh. "Lord preserve us," she murmured. "I thought we'd never see a real home again." "Where exactly did you ladies come from?" Tom asked as he ladled stew into wooden bowls. The women exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Margaret cleared her throat. "We came from a place that called itself a center for women's improvement. Government-sponsored, they said. Reality was somewhat different." Eleanor's voice carried the weight of years when she spoke. "They said we were too old, too troublesome, too expensive for our families to manage. Said they'd take care of us proper." Her laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Care? That's what they called it." Tom set down his ladle, understanding beginning to dawn. "You're talking about an institution." "We're talking about a prison," said a dark-haired woman Tom hadn't heard speak before. "Dressed up in pretty words and government seals, but a prison all the same. They took us from our homes, from our families, told everyone we needed specialized care for our own good. Margaret pulled back her sleeve, revealing a series of identical scars around her wrist. They marked us, like cattle. One by one, the other women showed similar scars. Said it was for medical purposes. Said a lot of things that weren't true. Tom felt his hands begin to shake, the same tremor that had plagued him since the wars. These women hadn't just escaped from some asylum. They'd escaped from something that bore all the hallmarks of a military operation. The precision of their movement, the way they'd organized themselves for survival, the scars that looked suspiciously like the identification marks he'd seen used on prisoners of war. "How long were you there?" he asked. "Some of us 2 years," Margaret replied. "Eleanor here, nearly 3. They kept telling our families we were getting better, that we needed more time. Truth was, most families stopped asking after the first year." Eleanor's voice broke. "My own son signed the papers, said I was too much trouble, that he couldn't manage a mother and his own family too. Guess trouble found its way home after all." Tom stared into the fire, feeling the weight of recognition settle over him like a familiar coat. He knew exactly what kind of operation these women had escaped from, because he'd helped establish similar facilities during the Indian campaigns. Places where inconvenient people disappeared under the cover of government compassion. The question now was whether he had the strength to protect them from what was surely coming. The morning of August 12th dawned crisp and clear, but Tom Brennan woke with the taste of copper in his mouth and the certainty that his quiet life was about to end. He'd spent the night listening to the women's quiet conversations through the thin cabin walls, catching fragments that made his old soldier's instincts scream warnings. They spoke in hushed tones about schedules, guard rotations, and something they called the Patterson method. Tom found Margaret O'Connor sitting on his front porch at sunrise, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, staring out at the mountains with the 1,000-yard stare he recognized from too many battlefields. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, settling beside her on the wooden steps. Margaret turned to study his face, her green eyes sharp with intelligence that no government facility could diminish. "Tell me, Mr. Brennan, what do you know about institutions for the improvement of undesirable women?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. "I know the government's got a talent for making problems disappear under pretty names." "The Patterson Civilization Center," Margaret said, her voice flat. "Ever heard of it?" Tom's blood went cold. Patterson, the same name the lead woman had mouthed yesterday through his rifle scope. He kept his expression neutral, but inside, pieces of a puzzle he'd been dreading began clicking into place. "Can't say I have," he lied. Margaret smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "It's a remarkable place, Mr. Brennan. Built like a fort, staffed like a military installation, and run by a man who believes that society's problems can be solved by removing troublesome elements and retraining them for useful service." She paused, sipping her coffee. "They told us we were there for our own good. Women who'd been deemed unfit for society, widows without family, spinsters with too many opinions, wives who'd outlived their usefulness." Inside the cabin, Tom could hear Eleanor's voice rising as she shared her own story with the other women. "My boy David. He's got 5 children and a wife who never took to me. When I started forgetting things, just little things, mind you, she convinced him I was dangerous. Said I might hurt the grandchildren." Eleanor's voice cracked. "Next thing I knew, men in uniforms were at my door with papers, legal papers, all signed and proper. Said the state had determined I needed specialized care." Margaret's hands tightened around her cup. "They separated us by categories. The elderly who were burdens on their families, the widows with property their relatives wanted, the women who'd spoken out against local politics or church doctrine. They called it rehabilitation, but what they really did was break us down systematically, then build us back up as compliant workers." Tom's mouth went dry. "Workers for what?" Laundries, mostly. Sewing factories. We worked 12-hour days for the privilege of 3 meals and a cot in a dormitory that housed 50 women. They told our families we were learning useful skills and proper behavior. What we really learned was how to survive. From inside, another voice joined Eleanor's, a younger woman named Sarah Beth who couldn't have been more than 30. They had us on schedules tighter than any army base. Up at 5, work details until dark, lights out at 9 sharp. Anyone who complained got sent to the reflection rooms, isolation cells where they left you alone with your thoughts and a Bible until you learned to keep your mouth shut. Margaret stood and walked to the porch railing, her back straight as a drill sergeant's. The genius of it, Mr. Brennan, was that it was all perfectly legal. Families signed guardianship papers, courts approved the commitments, and the federal government provided funding for our care. On paper, we weren't prisoners. We were patients being helped. Tom's hands began to shake again, worse this time. He recognized the setup because he'd seen it before, had even helped implement similar programs during the Indian campaigns. Take people deemed problematic, isolate them from their communities under the guise of helping them, then use them as free labor while their families went on with their lives. Conscience is clear. "How did you escape?" he asked. Margaret's smile this time held genuine satisfaction. "We planned for 2 years, 10 of us, all from different backgrounds, all with different skills. Eleanor here might be 70, but she remembered every guard rotation, every weak point in their security. Sarah Beth could pick locks with a hairpin. Mary Kate knew which of the staff could be bribed and which couldn't." She paused. "And I knew how to plan a military operation." Tom's head snapped up. "Military operation?" "Oh, yes, Mr. Brennan. You see, before my late husband's family decided I was too independent for a proper widow, I spent 15 years as an army wife. I watched my husband plan campaigns, learn to read maps, and understand supply lines. The Patterson Center made one crucial mistake. They assumed that because we were women, we were helpless." Inside the cabin, Eleanor's voice grew stronger as she warmed to her tale. "We started small, memorizing routines, noting which staff members were kind and which were cruel. We learned to work the system, to appear compliant while we gathered information. Margaret here, she drew maps of the entire facility on scraps of fabric using charcoal from the laundry fires." Margaret nodded. "The final plan took 6 months to implement. We had to coordinate with kitchen staff to ensure we had food for the journey, arrange for one of the laundry wagons to develop convenient wheel trouble near the back gate, and create a distraction during the evening shift change." "The distraction was me," Eleanor called from inside, pride evident in her voice. 70 years old, and I started the biggest food fight that place had ever seen. While half the staff was trying to restore order in the dining hall, our girls slipped out through the laundry. Tom felt a cold weight settling in his stomach. If these women had escaped from a federal facility, there would be pursuit. And if Colonel Patterson was involved, the same Patterson who'd been his commanding officer during the most brutal campaigns of the Indian Wars, then the pursuit would be relentless and efficient. "Margaret," Tom said carefully, "what exactly do you know about Colonel William Patterson?" Her face went pale. "How do you know that name?" "Because," Tom said, making a decision that would change everything, "Patterson and I have history. And if he's the one hunting you, then we're all in more trouble than you know." The silence that followed was broken only by the mountain wind and the sound of Eleanor's voice from inside, still telling her story, unaware that the past had just caught up with all of them. The next 7 days passed in a blur of preparation and growing dread. Tom found himself studying the women with new eyes, watching how they moved together with the precision of a well-drilled unit. Eleanor, despite her 70 years, had become the group's unofficial strategist, her sharp mind cataloging every detail of their surroundings with military efficiency. During their second evening meal, she spread a hand-drawn map across Tom's kitchen table, marking escape routes and defensive positions with the confidence of a career officer. "The pass we came through," she said, tapping the paper with a gnarled finger. "It's the only way vehicles can reach this valley. But there are 3 footpaths through the rocks that could work for people on foot." She looked up at Tom. "Problem is, Patterson knows this country better than we do. He surveyed these mountains for the Army Corps of Engineers back in '75. Margaret added wood to the fire, her movements economical and purposeful. "Eleanor's right. Patterson isn't just hunting us. He's been planning for this possibility since the day we arrived at his facility. He knows we're smart enough to escape eventually, and he knows exactly where we'd run." Tom's cough had gotten worse over the past few days, leaving flecks of blood on his handkerchief that he tried to hide from the women. But Eleanor noticed everything. She'd taken to bringing him willow bark tea each morning, her motherly instincts overriding any pretense that she didn't see his deteriorating condition. "You're sicker than you're letting on," she said quietly on their 4th morning together, finding him doubled over behind the barn after a particularly violent coughing fit. Tom wiped his mouth and straightened, trying to recover his composure. "Just the mountain air. Takes some getting used to." Eleanor's expression was gentle but implacable. "Son, I've buried 2 husbands and raised 4 children. I know the sound of a man dying by inches." She placed a weathered hand on his arm. "How long do you have?" The simple compassion in her voice nearly broke him. "Months, maybe, not years." "Then we'd better make them count." Eleanor squeezed his arm. "These girls need someone who understands what they've been through, someone who knows what it means to be thrown away by the people who should have protected them." Her words hit deeper than she could have known. Tom's own family had disowned him after Sarah's death, unable to forgive him for bringing an Indian wife into their bloodline. His brother had written exactly once after the funeral, informing Tom that his name would no longer be spoken in their father's house. The isolation had been his choice, but the abandonment had been theirs. The women fell into ranch routines with surprising ease. Mary Kate, who'd been a seamstress before her commitment, mended their torn clothes and began altering some of Tom's spare shirts to fit the smaller frames. Sarah Beth, despite being the youngest at 28, had the steadiest hands and took over the delicate work of caring for Tom's few livestock. The others shared cooking duties, cleaning, and the endless small tasks that kept a mountain ranch functioning. But it was their evening conversations that revealed the true depth of their trauma. Huddled around Tom's fireplace, they shared stories that made his own wartime experiences seem almost merciful by comparison. Women separated from their children for asking too many questions about school board decisions. Widows whose property had been seized after they'd been declared incompetent. Elderly mothers whose own sons had signed commitment papers to avoid the expense of home care. "The cruelest part," said a soft-spoken woman named Catherine, "wasn't the work or the isolation. Yet it was how they convinced our families that we deserved it, that we were burdens who needed to be managed rather than people who needed to be loved." Tom found himself sharing pieces of his own story in return, how the Army had shaped him into a weapon, then discarded him when the wars ended, how Sarah's death had shattered his faith not just in God, but in the very idea that good people deserved protection from an indifferent world. "Sarah used to say that family wasn't about blood," he told them one evening, staring into the fire. "She said it was about who shows up when the world gives up on you." He looked around at the faces watching him. "Guess I'm finally understanding what she meant." On their 6th day together, the signs of pursuit became impossible to ignore. Tom found horse tracks near the valley's entrance, carefully placed to look like random travelers, but following patterns he recognized from his cavalry days. Someone was conducting reconnaissance, mapping the valley's approaches and exits with professional thoroughness. That evening he called the women together for a conversation none of them wanted to have. "They've found us," he said without preamble. "Professional trackers moving in standard search patterns. We have maybe 2 days before they're ready to move." Margaret's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. "How many?" "Hard to say. I count at least 3 different horses, but that doesn't mean much. Could be scouts for a larger force." Tom spread his own map across the table. "The question is whether we run or whether we fight." "We can't outrun cavalry," Eleanor said pragmatically. "Not with my old bones and Catherine's bad leg. And winter's coming. We'd never make it to Canada before the snows." Sarah Beth spoke up from her corner by the fire. "What about the law? Surely there are people who'd help if they knew what Patterson was really doing." Tom's laugh was bitter. "Patterson is the law, as far as this territory is concerned. He's got federal authority, military backing, and enough political connections to make us disappear permanently if we cause him trouble." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of impossible choices. These women had already lost everything once. Now they faced losing it again, or worse. "There's something else," Tom said, knowing he had to tell them the truth. "Patterson and I have history. Bad history. If he finds out I'm here, this becomes about more than just bringing you back. It becomes personal." Margaret's eyes sharpened. "What kind of history?" Tom met her gaze steadily. "The kind that involves graves and grievances that don't heal with time." Over the next day, as they prepared for whatever was coming, Tom watched these remarkable women transform from refugees into something approaching soldiers. Eleanor organized watches and communication signals. Margaret inventoried their meager weapons and ammunition. The others prepared emergency supplies and identified hiding places for the most vulnerable among them. But it was the quiet moments that revealed their true strength. Catherine, who'd been committed for melancholia after losing 3 children to diphtheria, spent hours teaching Sarah Beth to read from Tom's small collection of books. Mary Kate fashioned dolls from corn husks and scraps of fabric, explaining that every home needed something beautiful to remind people why life was worth living. Eleanor, despite her own fears, became the group's emotional anchor, offering comfort and wisdom with the patience of someone who'd learned that surviving meant more than just staying alive. Tom found his respect for these women growing daily. They'd been branded as society's failures, discarded as inconvenient problems, but they possessed a resilience and dignity that put his own struggles to shame. They'd created a family from nothing, built trust from shared trauma, and faced an uncertain future with a courage that humbled him. On their 7th evening together, as mountain shadows lengthened and the first hint of autumn touched the air, Eleanor found Tom sitting alone on his porch, staring out at the peaks that had been his sanctuary for so many years. "Regrets?" she asked, settling beside him with a soft grunt. "Plenty," Tom admitted, "but not about letting you ladies stay. For the first time in 19 years, this place feels like more than just a hiding spot." Eleanor nodded, understanding. "Home ain't a place, Tom. It's people who won't give up on you, even when you've given up on yourself." They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Tomorrow might bring soldiers and conflict and an end to the peace they'd built together. But tonight, for this moment, they were family, they were home, and that was worth fighting for. Dawn on August 21st broke cold and gray over the Colorado mountains, with mist clinging to the valley floor like smoke from a dying fire. Tom Brennan had been awake since 3, positioned on the ridge above his cabin with his old Army field glasses, watching the approaches to his hidden valley. What he saw made his blood run cold with recognition and dread. They came at first light, just as he'd taught them to 20 years ago. A full cavalry detail of 30 men, moving in textbook formation through the narrow pass that was the only wagon route into the valley. At their head rode a figure Tom would have recognized from a mile away, Colonel William Patterson, sitting his horse with the same rigid posture that had made him the terror of the Indian campaigns. But it was the additional force that made Tom's hands shake as he lowered the field glasses. Behind the cavalry, a supply wagon loaded with what looked suspiciously like siege equipment, and flanking the main force, at least a dozen men in civilian clothes who moved with the professional competence of hired guns. This wasn't a rescue mission. This was a military operation designed to leave no witnesses. Tom made his way back to the cabin as quietly as possible, finding the women already awake and organized. Eleanor had them positioned at strategic points throughout the building, each woman armed with whatever weapons Tom's small arsenal could provide. Margaret stood at the main window, a rifle cradled in her arms with the easy familiarity of someone who'd grown up around firearms. "How many?" Eleanor asked, without turning from her position at the side window. 40 plus, Tom replied, checking his ammunition for the third time that morning. Full cavalry detail, support staff, and what looks like hired muscle. Patterson's not taking any chances. Margaret's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. He knows we won't come quietly. After 2 years of planning our escape, he knows we'd rather die free than live caged. Through the thin cabin walls, they could hear the sound of approaching horses, the jingle of harness and the muffled commands of officers organizing their men. Tom positioned himself at the front window, his rifle trained on the pass where the cavalry would emerge from the tree line. His military training had taught him to calculate odds and assess tactical situations, and everything he saw told him they were facing hopeless numbers. The first rider to break from the trees carried a white flag, but Tom noticed the man kept his other hand close to his sidearm. Behind him, the main force fanned out in a classic siege formation, positioning themselves to cover every possible escape route from the valley. Patterson had learned his lessons well during the Indian campaigns. When dealing with desperate people, you contained them completely before you demanded surrender. "Thomas Brennan!" Patterson's voice carried clearly across the morning air, amplified by the natural acoustics of the valley. "I know you're in there, and I know you're harboring federal fugitives." Tom felt his chest tighten as he heard his real name spoken aloud for the first time in 19 years. Beside him, Margaret's eyes widened with understanding. "Thomas Brennan," she whispered. "Not Tom. You're Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Brennan of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry." Eleanor's head snapped around from her position at the window. The Brennan who led the winter campaign of '78? The one they called the Ghost Colonel because he could track anything through snow? Tom closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his past settling over him like a shroud. The same. Through the window, Patterson continued his demands. "You have 5 minutes to send out the women unharmed. Do that, and I'll consider your cooperation when I write my report about this unfortunate incident." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "Cooperation? He means he'll kill you quickly instead of slowly." Tom studied the faces around him, these remarkable women who'd built a family from shared trauma and mutual protection. Eleanor, whose own son had abandoned her to Patterson's facility. Catherine, who'd been committed for grieving too long over her dead children. Sarah Beth, whose only crime had been speaking out against corruption in her town's government. Each of them had been declared inconvenient by the people who should have protected them. "Ladies," Tom said quietly, "I need you to understand something. Patterson and I have a history that goes back to the Indian campaigns. Personal history. If I surrender myself, there's a chance he'll let you live." Eleanor's response was immediate and fierce. "Don't you dare, Tom Brennan. Don't you dare think about sacrificing yourself for us after everything we've been through together." Through the window, they could see soldiers dismounting and taking positions behind rocks and trees. Professional movements, no wasted motion. These men had done this before, and they were preparing for a siege that could last days if necessary. Margaret moved to Tom's side, her eyes blazing with determination. You want to know what I learned in 2 years at Patterson's facility? I learned that sometimes the only choice worth making is the one that lets you die on your feet instead of live on your knees. Sarah Beth spoke up from her position guarding the back door. Every woman in this cabin has been thrown away by people who were supposed to love them. We've all been told we were burdens, problems to be solved. But you never made us feel that way, Tom. You made us feel like family. The truth of it hit Tom like a physical blow. These women weren't just refugees he'd helped. They'd become the family he'd lost when Sarah died, the sense of purpose he'd abandoned when he'd left the army. They'd given him something to protect again, something worth more than his own damaged life. Patterson's voice boomed across the valley again. 4 minutes, Brennan. Send them out now, and I give you my word as an officer that they'll be treated according to regulations. Eleanor snorted. His word as an officer? That's rich, considering what his regulations did to us the first time. Tom made his decision. We fight, but we fight smart. Eleanor, you know military tactics better than anyone. What would you do if you were commanding this defense? The elderly woman's eyes lit up with fierce intelligence. Patterson's got numbers, but he's got disadvantages too. He can't use heavy firepower without risking damage to federal property, namely us. And he's operating under orders that probably require him to bring us back alive for questioning. Margaret nodded. Which means they'll try to force surrender through siege tactics, cut off our supplies, wait us out, then move in when we're weakened. But, Eleanor continued, they don't know the valley like we do now, and they don't know about the back trail through the rocks that leads to the old mine shaft. Tom felt a spark of hope. You're thinking of the escape route we scouted last week? I'm thinking of something better, Eleanor said with a smile that reminded Tom of a wolf showing its teeth. I'm thinking of turning their siege into our advantage. Through the window, Patterson raised his arm, and Tom could see soldiers beginning to advance in coordinated groups. The siege was beginning, and with it, the battle that would determine whether the family they'd built would survive the violence of the past. But for the first time since he'd seen the cavalry approaching, Tom felt something other than despair. He felt the fierce pride of standing with people worth fighting for, and the grim satisfaction of knowing that whatever happened, they would face it together. The war had come to his peaceful valley, but this time, Tom Brennan wouldn't be fighting alone. The first shot shattered the morning silence like a thunderclap, splintering the wood frame of Tom's front window and sending glass fragments across the cabin floor. Eleanor had been right about Patterson's tactical approach. The soldiers weren't shooting to kill, but to terrorize and force surrender. What she hadn't anticipated was how quickly the situation would spiral beyond anyone's control. Tom returned fire through the broken window, his shot deliberately aimed high to avoid hitting any of the advancing soldiers. He still harbored some foolish hope that this could end without bloodshed, that Patterson might remember the man he'd once served alongside rather than seeing only the obstacle he'd become. That hope died when a second bullet punched through the cabin wall inches from Margaret's head. "They're not playing games," Margaret said grimly, pressing herself against the log wall as splinters showered down around her. Those shots were meant to kill. The battle escalated with terrifying speed. Sarah Beth, positioned at the back window, cried out as a bullet grazed her shoulder, sending her stumbling backward into Catherine's arms. The sight of blood on the youngest member of their makeshift family triggered something primal in Tom's chest, a protective fury he hadn't felt since the day Sarah died in his arms. His next shot wasn't aimed high. The soldier who'd been advancing on the back of the cabin dropped with a scream that echoed off the mountain walls. Tom felt the familiar cold settle over him, the same emotional numbness that had made him an effective killer during the Indian campaigns. The man he'd been for 19 peaceful years was disappearing, replaced by the ghost colonel who'd terrorized the frontier. "Eleanor!" Tom shouted over the growing gunfire. "Take the women through the mine shaft tunnel. Get them out of here." Eleanor's response was immediate and fierce. I'm not leaving you to die alone, Tom Brennan. Before Tom could argue, the cabin door exploded inward under the force of a rifle butt, and 3 soldiers rushed inside. Margaret's rifle spoke first, dropping the lead man in his tracks. Catherine, moving with surprising agility for her age, swung a heavy iron skillet that connected with devastating force against the second soldier's skull. The third man raised his weapon toward Eleanor, and Tom's pistol barked twice in rapid succession. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Eleanor's ragged breathing and the distant shouts of Patterson reorganizing his forces outside. Tom looked around at the women, his family, and saw the same hollow shock in their eyes that he'd seen in his own reflection after every battle. They'd killed to protect each other, and that knowledge would mark their souls forever. "This isn't what any of us wanted," Margaret said quietly, staring down at the soldier she'd shot. "But they didn't give us a choice." Eleanor knelt beside Sarah Beth, examining the younger woman's wounded shoulder with practiced hands. "It's not deep," she announced. "Clean through the muscle. You'll live, child." Tom was reloading his rifle when the second wave hit. This time, Patterson's men came from multiple directions simultaneously, a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm their defenses through sheer numbers. Tom found himself fighting with the instinctive brutality of his military years, each shot carefully placed, each movement calculated for maximum efficiency. But they were outnumbered 10-1, and ammunition was running low. Catherine took a bullet in the chest while trying to cover Eleanor's retreat toward the back room. She fell against the stone fireplace, her breathing coming in short, wet gasps. Eleanor abandoned her own safety to crawl to Catherine's side, pressing her hands against the wound in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. "Tell my children," Catherine whispered, her eyes already glazing over. "Tell them I wasn't the burden they thought I was." Eleanor's tears fell freely as she closed Catherine's eyes. "You were a gift, child. Never forget that." The death of Catherine, gentle, melancholy Catherine who'd been committed for grieving too deeply, broke something fundamental in the cabin's defenders. Margaret's shots became wild with fury. Sarah Beth, despite her wounded shoulder, fought with the desperate strength of someone who'd already lost everything once. Eleanor moved through the chaos like an avenging angel, her 70-year-old frame animated by pure maternal rage. But it wasn't enough. Tom felt the bullet hit him high in the chest, spinning him around and slamming him against the cabin wall. His rifle clattered to the floor as his legs gave out beneath him. Through the haze of pain and gathering darkness, he could see Patterson himself stepping through the shattered doorway, his uniform immaculate despite the battle raging around him. "Secure the women," Patterson commanded his remaining soldiers, "and make sure Brennan doesn't bleed out before I get some answers." As consciousness faded, Tom's last sight was of Eleanor being dragged from Catherine's body, her dignified composure finally broken by grief and helpless rage. The family they'd built was being torn apart, and he was powerless to stop it. The battle was over. The good guys had lost. The iron shackles around Tom's wrists had rubbed his skin raw, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the agony of watching Patterson's soldiers load the surviving women into a military wagon like cargo. Eleanor sat with her spine straight despite her bonds, her silver hair catching the late afternoon sunlight as she stared at Tom with eyes that held no accusation, only sorrow. Margaret supported Sarah Beth, whose wounded shoulder had been roughly bandaged by a military medic more concerned with preventing death than alleviating suffering. Patterson stood over Tom, who was chained to a wooden post driven into the ground near his own front porch. The colonel looked exactly as Tom remembered him from their cavalry days: immaculate uniform, steel-gray mustache, and pale blue eyes that held all the warmth of a winter sky. But there was something new in Patterson's face now, a twisted satisfaction that spoke of personal vendettas finally being settled. 20 years, Patterson said conversationally, lighting a cigar with deliberate slowness. 20 years I've been wondering what happened to the great Thomas Brennan, hero of the winter campaign, the ghost colonel who could track a whisper through a blizzard. He took a long draw from his cigar. Imagine my surprise when I discovered you'd been hiding in these mountains like a common deserter. Tom's chest throbbed with each heartbeat, but he kept his voice steady. What do you want, William? Patterson's laugh was cold as mountain snow. What do I want? I want to watch you suffer the way I've suffered. I want you to feel what it's like to lose everything that matters to you. His voice dropped to a whisper. The way you made me lose Sarah. The name hit Tom like a physical blow. Sarah Patterson, William's younger sister, Tom's beloved wife, the woman who died in his arms during the Nez Perce conflicts. The truth he'd hidden from the women, from himself, came flooding back with devastating clarity. Sarah made her own choice, Tom said, though the words felt like ground glass in his throat. She chose to marry a soldier. She knew the risks. Patterson's face flushed with rage. She chose to marry my friend, my brother-in-arms. What she got was a man so obsessed with winning the war that he forgot to protect his own wife. He leaned closer, his voice venomous. You were supposed to keep her safe while I was commanding the southern divisions. Instead, you dragged her to that godforsaken trading post where she died bleeding out in a dirt-floor cabin. The memories came flooding back. Sarah's face pale with pain as she struggled to give birth to their child, the midwife's helpless tears as complications set in, the sound of approaching war parties in the distance that prevented them from seeking proper medical help. Tom had held his wife as she died, their stillborn son cradled in her arms, while hostile forces surrounded the trading post. I loved her, Tom whispered. You killed her, Patterson snarled. Your need to be the perfect soldier, to follow every order without question, to win at any cost, it killed the only family I had left. He straightened his uniform jacket with sharp, angry movements. My parents died when Sarah was barely 15. She was all I had, and you took her from me. Eleanor's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Mr. Patterson, you want to blame someone for your sister's death? Blame the men who started that war. Blame the politicians who sent soldiers to die for land and gold. But don't blame a man for loving a woman who chose to stand by his side. Patterson turned his cold gaze on Eleanor. The old woman has opinions. How refreshing. He nodded to one of his soldiers. Gag her? I'm tired of listening to the wisdom of society's refuse. As the soldier moved toward Eleanor with a strip of cloth, Tom felt something break loose inside his chest. Not physically, but spiritually. These weren't just women he'd been protecting. They were his family. And watching them being treated like animals triggered a rage that made his war fury seem tame by comparison. William, Tom said, his voice carrying the authority he'd once used to command cavalry charges. Let them go. Your quarrel is with me, not them. Patterson's smile was thin and cruel. Oh, but Thomas, you're wrong about that. You see, these women represent something far more valuable than mere revenge. He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. Federal seizure orders for mineral-rich land in this territory. It seems the government has discovered significant copper deposits in these mountains. Tom's blood went cold as understanding dawned. This was never about the women escaping your facility. The Patterson Civilization Center was always meant to be temporary, Patterson continued, clearly enjoying Tom's dawning horror. A convenient way to clear undesirable elements from valuable properties. Elderly widows with inconvenient land claims, wives whose husbands owned mining rights, women whose families wanted them declared incompetent for financial reasons. He refolded the document carefully. The beauty of it was that their own relatives signed the commitment papers voluntarily. Margaret's voice was hoarse with fury despite her gag. She managed to work the cloth loose enough to speak. "You bastard! You've been stealing from families, using their own love against them." Patterson shrugged. "I've been solving problems efficiently. Families get rid of burdensome relatives, the government acquires strategically important land, and society's unproductive elements get put to useful work. Everyone benefits." Eleanor had also worked her gag loose, her 70-year-old frame trembling with rage. "Everyone except the women you destroyed and the families you lied to." "The families were willing participants," Patterson replied coldly. "Amazing how quickly people will sign papers when you convince them it's for their loved one's own good." He turned back to Tom. "But you've created a problem, Thomas. These women have seen too much, know too much. They can't be allowed to return to their families with tales of government conspiracy." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Tom understood now why Patterson had brought such overwhelming force, why he'd been willing to conduct a military assault on a remote cabin. This wasn't a rescue mission, it was an execution squad with official paperwork. "The official report will state that federal fugitives resisted lawful arrest," Patterson continued conversationally. "That they were killed while attempting to escape custody. Very tragic but necessary for public safety." He drew his sidearm and checked the chambers with professional thoroughness. "As for you, Thomas, the records will show that you died defending your fellow criminals. Heroic in its way." Tom looked at the women, his family, and saw not defeat in their eyes but defiance. Even facing death, Eleanor sat with her chin raised. Margaret's gaze burned with uncompromising fury. Sarah Beth, despite her wounded shoulder, had managed to position herself protectively in front of the other women. "You're making a mistake, William," Tom said quietly. Patterson raised an eyebrow. "Am I? How so?" "You assume these women are helpless victims who'll die quietly to protect your secret." Tom's smile was grim. "But you never learned what I learned during 19 years in these mountains. Sometimes the people you throw away are the strongest ones of all." As if summoned by his words, a rifle shot cracked from the ridgeline above the cabin. One of Patterson's sentries toppled from his position with a cry of surprise. Then another shot from a different direction, and another. Patterson spun around, his face flushing with anger and confusion. "What the hell?" "The women you're looking for," came a voice from the tree line. "They weren't the only ones who escaped from your facility." Tom felt his heart leap as he recognized the voice. Dr. Samuel Morris, the physician who'd been committed to Patterson's facility for refusing to falsify medical records that would have supported fraudulent commitment proceedings. Behind him stepped a dozen other figures, men and women who'd been declared inconvenient by society and warehoused in Patterson's institution. The hunter had become the hunted, and the discarded people of Patterson's Civilization Center had come to settle accounts. The battle that followed was swift and decisive, but it wasn't the violence that would stay with Tom for the rest of his days. It was the moment when Dr. Samuel Morris cut through his shackles and helped him to his feet. Morris, a man in his 60s who had been committed for refusing to declare sane women insane, moved with the quiet competence of someone who'd spent months planning this rescue. "We've been tracking Patterson's movements for weeks," Morris explained as he examined Tom's chest wound with practiced hands. "When we learned he'd found you and the women, we knew this was our chance to end his operation permanently." Around them, the surviving members of Patterson's force were being disarmed and secured by the escaped inmates of the Civilization Center. Tom watched in amazement as people he'd been told were society's failures organized themselves with military precision. A former bank president who'd been committed after exposing corruption in his town's government directed the securing of weapons. A widow who'd been declared incompetent for refusing to sell her late husband's land coordinated medical care for the wounded. Eleanor was the first of the women to reach Tom's side, her weathered hands gentle as she checked his bandages. "You stubborn fool," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. I thought we'd lost you." Margaret and Sarah Beth joined them, both women showing the strain of the day's events, but alive and unbroken. Sarah Beth's shoulder wound had been properly dressed by Dr. Morris, and though she was pale from blood loss, her eyes held the same fierce determination that had carried her through 2 years of imprisonment. "Where's Patterson?" Tom asked, looking around the scene of controlled chaos. Morris's expression darkened. "Fled when the shooting started. Took a small group of his most loyal men and disappeared into the mountains." He paused, studying Tom's face. "But he won't get far. We have people positioned at every pass between here and the nearest telegraph station." As if summoned by their conversation, 2 of the rescued inmates appeared, escorting a bound and furious Colonel Patterson between them. The man who'd commanded absolute authority over hundreds of lives now looked diminished and ordinary, his perfect uniform torn and stained with mountain dirt. Patterson's eyes found Tom immediately, burning with hatred that 20 years of separation hadn't diminished. "This isn't over, Brennan. Even if these escaped lunatics managed to kill me, there are others who know about this operation. The land seizures will continue. The families who signed those commitment papers will never get their relatives back." Eleanor stepped forward, her 70-year-old frame radiating dignity despite everything she'd endured. "You're wrong about that, Colonel. You see, while you were busy playing soldier in these mountains, some of us were busy writing letters." She reached into her dress pocket and withdrew a thick bundle of papers, each one carefully folded and sealed. Letters to newspaper editors in Denver and Colorado Springs, to territorial representatives in Washington, to the families who thought their loved ones were safely cared for in your facility. Her smile was gentle but implacable, all detailing exactly what the Patterson Civilization Center really was, complete with financial records that Dr. Morris here was kind enough to copy before his own escape. Patterson's face went white. "You're bluffing. Those records were kept in a secure safe." Dr. Morris chuckled, producing a second bundle of documents from his medical bag. "Amazing what a lifetime of treating patients teaches you about human nature, Colonel. I knew a man like you would keep detailed records of your criminal activities, partly for bureaucratic protection, partly because you're proud of what you've accomplished." He held up the papers. Financial transactions, land seizure orders, correspondence with government officials, family commitment documents, everything needed to destroy not just your operation, but everyone who enabled it. Margaret moved to stand beside Eleanor, her voice steady and clear. "The letters were posted 3 days ago from Cedar Falls. By now, every major newspaper in Colorado has copies of your records. The territorial governor has evidence of your conspiracy. And most importantly, every family who signed commitment papers has received documentation proving exactly what happened to their relatives." Tom felt a deep satisfaction settle in his chest as he watched Patterson's carefully constructed world crumble around him. The man who'd destroyed so many lives through bureaucratic cruelty was finally facing the consequences of his actions. "You want to know the beautiful irony of it all, William?" Tom said, his voice gaining strength despite his injuries. "The women you thought were helpless victims turned out to be your most dangerous enemies. Eleanor here wasn't just a burdensome old woman. She was a territorial governor's wife who knew exactly how to navigate political channels. Margaret wasn't just a troublesome widow. She was a bank owner's daughter who understood financial fraud better than most lawyers." Eleanor nodded, her eyes twinkling with satisfaction. "And Catherine, God rest her soul, wasn't just a melancholy woman grieving her children. She was a school teacher who'd been documenting educational fraud in her district. The records she kept would have exposed half the corrupt officials in 3 counties. Patterson's shoulders sagged as the full scope of his defeat became clear. He'd spent years believing his own propaganda about the worthlessness of the people he'd warehoused, never realizing that their supposed unfitness for society was often just evidence of their integrity in a corrupt system. Dr. Morris stepped forward, his medical bag in hand. "Colonel Patterson, by the authority vested in me as a licensed physician and a witness to your crimes, I'm declaring you mentally unfit for command. You'll be committed to a proper medical facility for evaluation, one with actual oversight and legitimate medical supervision." The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Patterson, who'd built his career on declaring inconvenient people insane, was now facing the same fate at the hands of a doctor whose integrity he'd tried to destroy. As the afternoon sun began to set over the Colorado mountains, Tom found himself sitting on his porch, surrounded by the strangest family he could have imagined. 15 people who'd been declared society's failures, who'd been thrown away by the people who should have protected them, but who'd found strength in each other and dignity in their shared struggle. Eleanor sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. "What happens now, Tom? Do we scatter to the winds, try to rebuild our old lives?" Tom looked around at the faces watching him. People who'd become more than friends, more than allies. They'd become family in the truest sense of the word, bound together not by blood but by choice, by shared values, by the willingness to stand by each other when the world gave up on them. "We build something new," he said finally. "A place where people like us, people who don't fit into society's neat little boxes, can find belonging. Where being different isn't seen as a disease to be cured or a problem to be solved." Margaret smiled, the first genuinely happy expression Tom had seen on her face since their first meeting. "A community of misfits and outcasts?" "A family," Eleanor corrected gently. "A real family, built on choice rather than obligation, on love rather than duty." Dr. Morris pulled out a surveyor's map, spreading it across the porch railing. With Patterson's land seizure orders declared fraudulent, most of the properties taken through his scheme will revert to their rightful owners. This entire valley, along with about 10,000 acres of surrounding mountain land, belongs to various families who thought their relatives were safely institutionalized. Sarah Beth leaned forward, studying the map with interest. Families who might be very grateful to the people who exposed the truth about their loved ones' treatment. "Grateful enough to donate land for a special kind of community?" Tom asked. "Grateful enough to fund it," Dr. Morris replied with a smile. Patterson's financial records show that the Civilization Center was quite profitable. Those profits, legally speaking, belonged to the people who were exploited to generate them. As darkness fell over the mountains, Tom felt a peace he hadn't known since Sarah's death settling into his bones. The violence was over, the corrupt had been exposed, and the discarded people of society had proven their worth in the most fundamental way possible, by choosing to care for each other when no one else would. Tomorrow would bring challenges, paperwork, the long process of building something lasting from the ashes of Patterson's empire. But tonight, surrounded by the family he'd never expected to find, Tom Brennan was finally home. And home, as Sarah had always told him, wasn't about the place. It was about the people who showed up when the world gave up on you. Dear friends, this story of Tom and the women who found family in the most unexpected place speaks to a truth many of us know too well. How many times have we been told we're too much trouble, too set in our ways, or too expensive to care for? How many of us have watched our own children struggle with the burden of aging parents, seen the guilt in their eyes when they can't provide the care we need? The beautiful truth that Tom Brennan discovered is that family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when the world gives up on you. Eleanor, at 70, wasn't a burden to be managed. She was a strategist who saved them all. Margaret wasn't a troublesome widow. She was a leader who held them together. These women, discarded by society, found their worth in caring for each other. They proved that our value doesn't diminish with age. It deepens with wisdom, strengthens with experience, and grows more precious with time. True family chooses to stay, chooses to fight, chooses to love unconditionally. Sometimes the people who find us are more family than the ones who lose us. What does chosen family mean to you? Have you ever found belonging in unexpected places? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.